Well, thank you all for coming. You're all contradicting my assumption about Minnesotans and nice weather. So here you are, you've come indoors, and we're very glad to have you here joining us. I'm Peter, co-director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. Restrooms are downstairs. There is an elevator to use if you wish. This is my colleague Clarence, who is indeed controlling the slide projector.
As best I can.
Yeah. And so one of the things I like to say, here we are at the Eastside Freedom Library, where there's often a trade-off, and so tonight's trade-off is that so that we can all hear well, we've had to shut off the air conditioning system. We hope by this fall we will have replaced the heating and cooling system here, which is a small $250,000 that we've been working to raise. But it's unfortunate, particularly for those of us who stood too close to the speakers when we were younger, hearing can be challenging here when the system is on. So if it were winter, I would say sit close together. And summer, I'm not sure what the advice is, but I'm delighted you're here. This is part of a series that we're doing in partnership with the Ramsey County Historical Society called History Revealed. And once a month, we have someone who has written a book, or hello, John, or added to our scholarship in some significant way. And the Ramsey County Historical Society are great talent agents, finding interesting people to bring to us. And so I'm going to introduce Robin Priestley, who works for the Ramsey County Historical Society, and she's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you everybody for coming. We are so happy to be here at the Eastside Freedom Library for this series of programs. It's a great space, and every month I look forward to coming here because I just love having people come in and use this space, and they're just such wonderful hosts. So I'll introduce Krista in a minute, but first of all, I want to let those of you know who are not members of the Ramsey County Historical Society that these programs are sponsored by our membership. We don't get grants, we don't get any outside funding. If you are a member, thank you. I know there's a number of members in the group, and they've heard this speech probably a million times before. But if you're not a member, not only do you support programs like this, but you get free admission to our historic site, Gibbs Farm, up on Larpenteur in Cleveland. Plus, you also get a subscription, if I don't drop everything here, to our quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History. It's a fantastic magazine. The level of scholarship, it's award-winning throughout the country. We have several authors here, including Krista. And if you're interested, please see me after the program. There's information on the table right where Allison is sitting too. So thank you again, all of you, for being members. And I want to bring your attention to a couple things. There are flyers in the back. Next Tuesday, which is the 11th, we have Adam Ardvinson coming to talk about Wild and Rare, his new book on tracking endangered species in the upper Midwest. That will be at the Gibbs Farm on the corner of Larpenteur and Cleveland. We have a very special prairie tour with Minnesota naturalists starting at 6, and then Adam will start his program at 7, and the books will be available for signing. I have the book. It's a fantastic book. On Thursday, June 13th, at Waldman Brewery and Worstery, which is over on Smith Avenue off of 7th Street, Kitty Goggins is going to talk about her family's journey into the area, into Minnesota and St. Paul. So her title is A Thread in the Multicultural Fabric of Ramsey County, a story of World War II refugees and their children. And so they were also involved in the International Institute, and it looks to be a fantastic program. We do need reservations for that, so if you're interested, again, see me afterwards. And then on Saturday, June 15th, Peter will be leading a very special walking tour talking about immigration and the history of the East Side. So again, we do need reservations for that, so if you are interested, you can see either me or Peter after the program. That will be starting at 10 a.m. and we'll be meeting here. So those are just some of the upcoming programs we have. There's flyers on the table again, and a calendar including Gibbs Farm upcoming ice cream Sundays and family Saturdays and so forth. So let me introduce Krista. Krista Finstad Hanson is the author of 2 travel guides to museums and historic houses, Minnesota Open House, and Wisconsin's Historic Houses and Living History Museums. Krista has also written the children's science textbook, The Great Barrier Reef, A Natural Wonder. And she's recently, in this current issue of our Ramsey County History magazine, she has a wonderful article in there. And if you didn't get a copy, there are copies for free on the table in the back. She's also written for numerous other journals, magazines, and so forth, both local and nationally, on architectural history, homes, and other subjects. And she's been a teacher and a mom and many other things, including a fantastic researcher. So, Krista?
Thanks for being here again on a nice day. And then if you love history, you know it's a really important day, the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and you could probably be someplace else hearing about that, I'm sure. But so thank you for coming out, and I know about half of you, so thank you to all the people that I know who are here. So my topic tonight is Cultures Coming Together in St. Paul because of the 100th anniversary of the International Institute. So I've been an adult ESL teacher for 20 years, this year is 20 years, and I've worked for 13 of those years at the International Institute. So Clarence, what's our sign? I'm just gonna go like this, there we go. So in 2013 I was working at the Institute and we had a staff meeting and our executive director said, in 2019 it will be the 100th anniversary of the Institute. Does anyone want to help figure out what the history is? I think I was the only one who raised my hand. I'm pretty sure I was the only one because I came up with the plan and nobody else helped me with this plan. I was teaching full-time. We taught on quarters, so I had a quarter break 4 times a year. So I said I can do some of the research, but can I supervise interns as well? So from 2013 to 2016, I had 21 interns. The Institute had given their records to the U of M, to the Immigration History Research Center Archives, which is now in the Anderson Library. It was at the Berry Library way back when, if you know about that. So 3 years, 21 interns researched there, and then I had 1 intern who worked at the Minnesota Historical Society because there were some materials there, and then I had a Geographic Information Systems intern who made some maps. Then in the spring of 2017, this amazing circumstance happened. It's a long story, but I met a professor from McAllister, Donica Kermichieva, who was Bulgarian, who participated in the festival, and she and I came up with this idea of this class. So the class took all of those notes that were either Word docs or Excel docs from all the boxes at the U. Then they culled out of that materials to make a digital timeline. And that was a really helpful document. And then all that time that the students were working at the U, the curator, Ellen Engseth, and the archivist, Daniel Nietzsches, they did the orientations with the students. So I met them at the Institute, then they did an orientation at the U, and I just had to let them go and see what they could find. From 2016 to 2018, Paul Shadowald at McAllister, he's the Associate Director of the Civic Engagement Center. He facilitated that partnership, and again, it was a major effort on McAllister's part to help the Institute in this project. Then I left the Institute in 2016, I went back to the St. Paul Public Schools, and I got an independent historian research fellowship at the Minnesota Historical Society. We were a cohort group, and so it was really cool to be with other historians working on other projects, and historians love to talk about their projects, so we had people that would listen to us. Well, so my project then was a chapter of the Institute's history that we found out about at the archives. The Institute helped resettle Japanese Americans out of internment camps during World War II. I had never heard about that. So I did a research project on that. And then I partnered with the Japanese American Citizen League, and I asked them if they would help me with my project. And they said, sure, well, will you help us with ours? They had an exhibit at Fort Snelling last summer, and it just worked out perfect timing that my research that I was doing was what their topic was. It was the Japanese American World War II experience. So my research was part of that exhibit last summer at Fort Snelling. And then last summer I had a student from McAllister, Chiren Dolma. McAllister had some foundation money from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. They paid her. She was not an intern. She was paid to work with me. She was my tech guru. She helped me with the research. She helped me with the photographs, and then she made maps that I'm going to show you tonight. And then I had another grant that came through the Institute from MHS last year for myself to finish up the research. And then Michael Sylvan is here. And Michael Sylvan is a Festival of Nations volunteer. And on his own, he had gone through boxes and boxes of photos at the Institute, scanned them on his own time, and then went through all the materials and made a database of the Festival of Nations history. And we did not connect until after he had done the work, and I was almost done with the work. So his work was just so instrumental in this project as well. So these are the people that got us going on this project. And then here's the students. So I'm not going to tell you all the students, but 21. Actually, a couple of them were graduates, so recent graduates. Everyone's from Minnesota. Some of the people went to different colleges, but they were Minnesotans, either home for the summer. 6 were at the U of M, and 1 was a recent graduate. And then here's that beautiful McAllister class. So 21 interns, 14 students in the McAllister class. Over 40 people worked on this project with me. Zornitsa, so I'm in the red sweater. Zornitsa is next to me. She's now at the U of M. Paul Shadowald is kitty corner behind me, and John Meyerhofer, one of the librarians, is there. So those 14 students did an amazing amount of work, and I'm actually going to highlight their work tonight. So the digital timeline was the history of the Institute, the history of immigration policy to the United States, and the history of immigrants coming to Minnesota. So it's 3 layers on this digital timeline. And so again, I'm going to try to pull that out tonight to share with you. So they had foundation money that paid me to be a part of the class. I wasn't a co-teacher, but I was a community scholar in residence, which was a really cool title. And then they had foundation money to support the creation of this digital timeline. Okay, so the International Institute of Minnesota was not the only one. It was started in 1911 in New York City. This is Edith Terry Bremer. She was with the YWCA, and the YWCA served single women, and the YMCA served single men. But some of these people were from different countries, and they had different needs. And so she came up with this idea to serve the foreign-born women that were coming to the Institute. Well, those women brought their husbands and their children, so very quickly on, they started serving everybody. The Institute was started here in St. Paul in 1919. We just had the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. We already had a big international community and anticipating a bigger community coming. So we were started at that time. The Institute offered English and citizenship classes, casework services, and activities for St. Paul's ethnic communities. The Institute broke away from the Y in 1938 and became the International Institute Incorporated. That was happening nationwide. Everyone was separating so they could get their own funding. That was the big thing. The Institute has continued in a variety of ways to help the foreign-born adjust to American life while retaining their cultural heritage. So I found this article, newspapers.com is a really fun website to be on. They have these scanned papers. This is from Bemidji. It was the AP News reel coming out about the Institute starting in St. Paul. And basically the Institute set out a national search for other communities that they thought could use an institute, and St. Paul came up as one because they had 17,000 aliens. Those are people that had not become citizens. And during World War I, if you were German, you had to have documents, you had to have pictures taken and carry this with you at all times to say that you were an alien. Other cultures didn't have to do that. So there was this big Americanization push that was going on during World War I and afterwards. So the Institute was going to need a great need. 17,000 is quite a lot. So this is one of Tren's infographics. So she did GIS, Geographic Information Systems, analysis of the 1920 census. And the foreign-born white population in Minnesota was 20.4% of the total state population. Within that percentage, more than 20 countries are represented. But as you can see, it's the Northern Hemisphere. The population was over 2,387,000. And in that, there was a very, very small Chinese and Japanese population here, and then American Indians as well. This does not include African Americans. And of course, I always have to say, this is not a story of Native Americans and African Americans. This is a story of immigrants coming to America after World War I. And so we think of us as a Scandinavian state. And that's really true. That plays out in 1920. The big bar over there is from Sweden, 23%, and then 18% from Norway, and 15% from Germany. Anyone know that in your family you had people in 1920 in Minnesota who were born in other countries? Yeah? Yeah?
What was the question?
Do you have people in your family who were here in 1920 that were born in other countries? What countries do you want to just yell out? What countries? Ireland, Denmark, Germany, Sweden. Yep. So you can see that's your family. And I'm from Wisconsin. My mom's family was in Wisconsin, but my dad's family was in Minnesota. I had a great-grandfather from Denmark, and I had great-great-grandparents who were Germans from Russia. So the census said they were from Russia. So that's who we see of those 20 countries represented. The big ones were Sweden, Norway, and Germany. So we found the International Institute's first annual report at the Institute. It was a find. That was not in the archives, it was in a box, in a closet at the Institute. In 1921, the staff was 4 caseworkers. They spoke German, Italian, and Norwegian, and Polish, and they served people from 13 countries. So that's who they were serving, those new Americans. They helped new Americans overcome barriers such as learning English, becoming citizens, and finding jobs. Caseworkers took people to appointments and made home visits. The Institute's cultural programs helped connect new and old stock Americans to share similarities and celebrate differences. It's exactly the work that they're doing 100 years later. Exactly the same, and more so. Here's a nice picture from sometime in the 20s, one of those cultural gatherings, people in their different costumes, and it's outside of the downtown Central Library. So what I'm going to tell you now is the story about the immigration policy. Everything that the Institute did was reflected on the people that could come, and that was based on the United States government policies. And then I'm going to talk about the festive nations as the one thing that I'm going to highlight of the work of the Institute. So the Immigration Act of 1924 is pretty infamous. Again, this could be a whole topic in its own right. We opened up the doors after World War I. We opened our arms to immigrants, and then pushback came, and those doors were essentially closed. This act, signed by President Coolidge, established national origins quotas. Immigration visas were given to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States as of the 1890 census. So, tiny, tiny amount. And, of course, all from Europe, for the most part. It completely excluded immigrant visas for people from Asia. It followed existing nationality laws dating from 1790 and 1870, excluding people from Asian countries from becoming citizens. So those were on the books for decades, and they remained on the books. If you were born in an Asian country, you could not become a citizen. And in many places, you couldn't own property. The 1924 Act meant that even Japanese would not be admitted to the United States. There was a gentleman's agreement with Japan in 1917, and then that got revoked in 24. So Alice Sickles was the 3rd executive secretary, but she's kind of famous. For a long time, people thought she was the first, but she started in 31, and the Institute started in 1919. She served till 1944, and then she went to the Institute in Detroit until 1959. She began what became the Festival of Nations in 1932. It was not the first Festival of Nations. The New York City one had the first one, and there's still institutes that have Festival of Nations now, St. Louis and Milwaukee. So the 3-day event was called a Homelands exhibit. In 1932, it celebrated 15 cultural groups. It was held at the Y. The 1933 event was a folk fete held outside at Como Park, but it almost rained, so Alice Sickles said, never again. So the 3rd one, they called it a folk festival, and it was the first to be held at the St. Paul Civic Auditorium. So the Y was at 123 Fifth Avenue, which is where the St. Paul Companies or Travelers is now. It's across from the Ordway, next to the Landmark Center. Where the Ordway was where the St. Paul Civic Auditorium was. So it was a quite big event to be able to have it at the auditorium. So from the Institute's boxes, this is what Michael Sylvan was working in. All the programs are there, and these gorgeous old photos. The 1936 event was the first to be called the Festival of Nations, and it had grown to 32 cultural groups. Now these groups were already here. It just took that time to get them to connect with the Institute and create their own groups to be able to have participants in the event. So here's inside the auditorium. Those facades were designed by a female architect, Dorothy Ingeman. Local theater set designers painted them, and then they had National Youth Administration youth painting these sets. The program took place on the floor, and you sat little cafe tables or up in the stands, and then those booths were where you bought the wonderful ethnic food. So there was a community that was here, and that was growing in the 1930s. It was the Mexican community on the west side. This was a new community that the Institute was working with. Mexicans were here on the census in 1860, But in the 20s and 30s, they came to Minnesota at the invitation of sugar beet farmers, and they paid a head tax to cross the border, and later became the Bracero Program. They were settling in St. Paul on the west side. Here's a clipping showing a sewing circle that was happening, and that was a WPA program. And then the Institute had what we now call an outreach class, held in a home on the west side, and had a WPA teacher running that class. The 1930 census says that 3,626 people were born in Mexico living in Minnesota, and 628 were in St. Paul. This was during the Depression. There was a lot of pushback, a lot of negative conversation in the community, and actually 15% of the community was deported in 1931. So it was always a difficult situation being from Mexico and being in this country. It was never easy to cross the border and come here. But these people were trying to stay and set up new lives. So the Institute connected with them, and they did a survey to see what they needed, and they served them in their community. So again, we call that outreach now, but that's what they were doing at that time. And then we see the community form and come to the Festival of Nations. So that's why my topic is connecting these cultures in St. Paul, because the Institute was a place where everybody could come and they could have meetings there, and they could get English classes and civ classes, but the Institute was trying to help them keep their own cultural heritage as well. So 39, we see the group at the Festival of Nations for the first time, and I love the old Pioneer Press clippings because it tells you their name and where they lived, so you can also see where that community was. And again, more beautiful pictures. This is the Armenian booth and the Ukrainian booth, and if you go to the festival now, the booths don't look like this. 1939, look at that gorgeous Armenian booth. There were 62 people born in Armenia living in Minnesota in the 1930 census. That's a very small community. 2 families, the Nakashians and the Keljiks. They're Oriental rug dealers, and they're still connected within the community here. And so you just can see how beautiful that booth is. And then the Ukrainian group was a little bit bigger, but only 647. On the census, they were Ukrainians or Ruthenians on the census. But again, these are the things that they're handcrafted things that they brought with them when they came to this country. And that's what they were showing in the exhibit booth. And this is what it looks like at the festival. If you're looking down from above, it still looks like this. The masses of people trying to get over and get the crepes, or the baklava, or the sambusas. And then you can hear wonderful ethnic music and see everybody in their costumes. So first weekend in May, this is still what you can see when you go to the festival. So the world changed with World War II. We did not enter it right away. It started in 1938. We did not enter the war until after the Japanese Imperial Army attacked the U.S. Naval Base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. This order gave the Secretary of War and the military commanders the power to exclude all persons of Japanese ancestry from designated areas in order to provide security against sabotage. This is a huge, huge change in our country. These were people that had not done anything wrong except the country where they were born attacked us. So that was the start. And then just to kind of just clipped along pretty fast. There were public hearings, but the federal government did what they were going to do. March 18, 1942, the War Relocation Authority was put in place through another executive order, and then March 21, 1942, Congress passed Public Law 503, forcing the removal of 110,000 Japanese Americans and Native Japanese to internment camps built by the U.S. military in 10 remote locations. Again, the Japanese could not own property, but if they had been here long enough and had children who were over 18, they could put the property in their children's names. Many had businesses, many had farms. They lost everything. For the most part, people lost everything. They could only take what they could carry. Many came back to find their places ransacked, other people living in their property. Some people were able to avoid that because they knew their neighbors and were friendly with their neighbors, but that was not always the case. So here's one of the camps, the Minidoka camp at Hunt, Idaho. It was a really unknown situation how long the war was going to go on. The camps were built hastily. They were really tar paper shacks. They were not insulated. Idaho is cold in the winter. Families were living in very small quarters, again, with whatever they could take. The camps, like I said, they sort of started in the fall of '42. They were closed by the Supreme Court in January of 1945. The war was still going on. It was a process to get people in, and it was a process to get people out. So the Institute decided to be a part of the process. They were actually asked if they wanted to, and they had to decide. So they had this meeting of Institute leaders, community leaders, including the president of McAllister was there, and then 3 reverends. In red, I have highlighted Mr. and Mrs. Earl Tanvara. They were a pair of resettled Japanese Americans who came to that meeting. They had special circumstances, unique circumstances. They got out before having to go to the camps. They came in August. And they knew one of the 13 people of Japanese descent who was here in St. Paul, Henry Matsushita, and he offered them a place to stay on James. And her brother, Ruth's brother, was stationed at Fort Snelling. The day after December 8th was when President Roosevelt asked to declare war, and that was a Sunday. And so Monday, the 9th, he enlisted in the Army. And he was stationed at Fort Snelling because he could not be stationed on the West Coast. So she had 2 connections here. And so there was actually a committee in Minneapolis. I don't want to discredit Minneapolis. The Lutheran Churches of America had a resettlement committee too. There were only 35 communities nationwide that offered to do this resettlement. And Genevieve Stiefel was the lady in Minneapolis. Ruth Gage Colby was the woman in St. Paul. Between the 2 of them, they helped more than 1,000 Japanese Americans secure work. Mrs. Colby alone found jobs for 450 people in about a year's time. So again, there were soldiers at Fort Snelling. There were military weddings happening. A lot of the people that wanted to come to Minnesota had a fiance or a brother or an uncle or husband who was stationed at Fort Snelling. There were more than 6,000 Japanese Americans stationed at Fort Snelling during the course of the war. So that was the work that they were doing. They had to be sponsored on a case-by-case basis, have a job and housing before they could get out of the camps. And it was only Japanese Americans, not Japanese. So the war ended May, we just had the anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, VE Day. And then the war ended tragically in Japan with the dropping of 2 atomic bombs. So already it had been 3 years' time, the Institute was doing this on a case-by-case basis. Now people were free to come and go, and they knew more people were going to be coming to St. Paul. Housing was really hard, it was really tight during the war, and they knew it was going to get tighter. So they decided to have a hostel. I should say that Minneapolis had already had a hostel. They were a little bit behind. This was a residential hotel on the 2nd floor of 191 West Kellogg. That is not there anymore. That's where the St. Paul River Center is now, where the Festival of Nations is held. Next door was 183 Kellogg. The Institute had bought that in 1944, and they remodeled it and moved in June of '46. The lawyer who was serving as the notary public was Warren E. Berger. He later became a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So I think that's pretty cool that he joined the Institute in this committee. So here's some beautiful PR. Again, this was a sensitive topic. People were not really keen on having Japanese here, so it was a lot of public relations that they were doing. And so here's this beautiful family, new at 7 Corners. The hostel is a refuge for Nisei. The Nisei are the first generation born in America. It's the Japanese term for those people. So this is a woman and her 2 children, and her husband is stationed at Fort Snelling. So that's why they're here. They have been in the camps, they got out, and needed a place to stay. Okay, so back to the policy. So we had those quotas in place. And those quotas in place were throughout the war. Of course, during the war, people didn't come. But after the war, they passed this War Brides Act. It was for brides at first, but there were WACs. There were women in the service as well. So some husbands came, and of course, children might have been born. So 120,000 people were allowed to immigrate to the U.S. They came mostly from Europe, but then they had an addendum to allow people from Japan and Korea to come as well. And this act negated the quotas. It did not have to be in that 2%. So again, they kind of opened up a special door for people for a short period of time. And maybe, Andy, maybe your family was a part of that. Your mom was a war bride. Yeah, so there was a special circumstance that they allowed for a short period of time. Okay, and then we see that community forming. So there were 13 people of Japanese descent in St. Paul, 51 in the state of Minnesota in 1940, and by the 1950 census there were 1,049. So that population had grown, and then this is who had stayed. The Japanese group came to the Festival of Nations in 1947. In the back, the person in the black with the white, that's Ruth Tambara, the person who I studied. And I was able to meet her niece, Judy Nomura Murakami. This is a family photo. Judy's the little girl in the picture. She was a girl and was in the camps. Her family, Ruth's parents and siblings and Earl's parents and sister were all in the camps. So when they got out, they came to St. Paul too. So our country really didn't do much for people in war-torn Europe until 1948. It took a lot. It was political, right? It was argued about and debated about what to do and who should come. So they decided on the Displaced Persons Act that it could be for select European residents who could come to become permanent residents of the United States. The law's provisions were temporary. Actually, it was 48 to 50 was 200,000 people, and then 50 to 52 was another 200,000 people could immigrate over those 4 years. So who came to Minnesota in that time? The book They Chose Minnesota is an awesome book. It was such a great reference for me, and the McAllister students used it as well. So the book tells us that the act required that all displaced persons must have sponsors who guaranteed that the refugees had adequate housing, a job which did not replace an American, and paid transportation to the port of entry to their destinations. So again, just like with the Japanese, they had to be sponsored. A person here had to sponsor them out of the camps. And they had to be in a registered displaced persons camp, so it couldn't be just anyone. It had to be these select people. So the book shows who was here from the various countries in Minnesota and who was here nationwide. So from Hungary, 162, Latvia, 1,300, Estonia, 209, Lithuania, 143, Czechs and Slovaks, 151, Poland, 2,800 Polish people came to Minnesota. Nationwide, they were 37% of all the displaced people. The South Slav group was the Serbo-Croatians, Slovenians, and Bulgarians, 530, Romanians, 640, and the Ukrainians, I don't know. The book did not give a number. But I was really heartened to see that within this total number, 1,100 of these people were Jewish. And what's really sad is that, because of our quotas, people were trying to get out. People were trying to help people get out after 38. And because of those quotas, they wouldn't budge. And we know the horrible story about President Roosevelt sending back a ship with people on it. One of those people that was able to get out was Albert Einstein. So, we just did not do enough for people. So it's nice to see that of the survivors of the Holocaust, that some of those people were included here and came to Minnesota. So I got some information about the Ukrainians from the festival book. The 1958 festival celebrated the 100th anniversary of Minnesota statehood. And the committees, the cultural committees, had to write their story about coming to Minnesota and then pick a prominent person in the community. So they picked Alexander Granovsky. And he came to the U.S. from the Ukraine in 1913. He attended college in Colorado and Wisconsin in English. Always just amazing to think. He spoke Ukrainian. He had to learn English first and then go to college. He received a PhD in entomology, which is the study of insects. He taught at the U of M. He developed DDT. Not the best thing to celebrate, but it was his brain that came up with that insecticide. He became active in many Ukrainian American organizations and the Institute, and his son, Robert, was a later board president of the Institute. So the booklet talks about that Dr. Granovsky is a member of St. Michael's Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Minneapolis, whose congregation has sponsored nearly 500 families from the displaced people who lost their homes in Ukraine during Nazi and communist invasions. So we don't know that number. 500 families could be 1,000 people. And like I said, the book did not give a number for the Ukrainian community, but that's the work that they did. They had to sponsor people, find them housing, find them jobs, and he and his church did that work. So again, we opened up the door for a few years for select people to come, and then there was pushback. the tide changed again. We were letting in people from Eastern Europe. Communists were invading their country. They were fleeing communism. We were anti-communist, but we closed the door against them because how do we know that they're not communists, right? So that was what happened in the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952. It was also known as the Karen-Walter Act. It was created in reaction to the Cold War and fear against communism. The act went back to those quotas from 1924 to ensure that the communist influence from Eastern European countries would be limited. The act created a system of preferences by skills for visa applicants. It's the first time we see that. But like everything in politics, sometimes something good comes in, gets snuck in there at the last minute. This act abolished racial restrictions found in the United States Immigration and Naturalization statutes going back to the Naturalization Act of 1790. The positive ramification is that Japanese, Korean, and Chinese nationals could now apply for citizenship. So, the Institute was busy. All of those people that were here went to the Institute for classes and got help to become citizens. Well, we closed the door, but then there was a special circumstance. Some people in Hungary rose up. There was a revolution against communism in 1956. It was sadly a failed revolution, but many people fled the country to Austria, and Austria demanded help from the West to respond to this refugee crisis. So the United States was anti-communism. They decided to open up the door for a little window. They resettled 38,000 Hungarians for a year. It is estimated about 300 Hungarian freedom fighters came to Minnesota by 1958, and they also had to be sponsored by churches and friends and family members who were already here. So again, the Institute was involved in that. They were coordinating the paperwork and helping people figure out how to sponsor these people from Hungary. And another communist revolution, the other way, right, creating a communist country in Cuba. This day in 1959 was the day that marked the start of the revolution against the Batista government. Fidel Castro was one of those rebels. He became the prime minister, and in 1976 became the president of Cuba. He created the first communist country in the Western Hemisphere. So then Cubans came to Minnesota. They were airlifted out. They actually all came to Florida, and then they were airlifted to different places. And this is an article from 1964 that now we see them in the festival. And the article says that there were 100 families. Again, I don't know. That could be 800 people. Just really don't know how big those families were. But I did see another article that gave the same kind of statistics. So I don't know how many people came at that time, but there they are at the festival. Okay, so the big Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, was the key thing that President Kennedy was working towards. He actually wrote a book called A Nation of Immigrants. Very nice chapter on Irish immigrants in that book. It may have been ghostwritten, I don't know. But it was his idea to push this new policy. Everything was still in place from before. Those 2% quotas were still in place. So here's this lovely picture of President Johnson signing the act on Liberty Island. Next to him is our Minnesota Vice President, Hubert H. Humphrey. Bobby Kennedy is second from the right, and probably some Secret Service people in the back there. So it abolished that national origins quota system, and then it replaced it with preference categories that addressed family reunification. They put a cap of 170,000 visas per year from the Eastern Hemisphere, and no country could have more than 20,000 visas, and then 120,000 visas from the Western Hemisphere, which included Mexico. That then was the start of another big change for Mexicans. That Bracero Program was in place until '64, just having to pay that head tax to cross the border to be able to work. Now they had to apply for immigrant visas, just like everybody else. So European and Canadian immigration declined, and Asian immigration rose sharply. So that preference category for family members, first preference was for spouses, and this was not in those quotas, so anybody's spouse could come. And then unmarried children under 21 years of age who are U.S. citizens, the parents were U.S. citizens born abroad, orphans adopted abroad, and then orphans adopted in the U.S. by a U.S. citizen, and then the parent of a U.S. citizen who is at least 21 years old. That's a topic that has become in conversation lately, the birthright citizenship, and the idea that when you're 21, you can sponsor your foreign-born parents. That's been happening since 1965, and is currently up for debate. So that was all in place in that 1965 Act. So for Minnesota, Koreans became the second largest group of immigrants. Did you know that? Lots of the people that came were working class Koreans, many of who became small business owners. In my neighborhood in the Hamlin Midway on Snelling, there's a Koreatown. Lots of those businesses got started then. They first came to the Festival of Nations in 1973, and of course some of these were adopted children. We had the Korean War, of course. So the community that we see is having an event at the New Institute at 1694 Como. The downtown location, they lost it to eminent domain in 1970 when the St. Paul Civic Center was built. That's no longer there now, of course, it's the River Center. So this was an event inside the current institute. And then the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War started basically around the time of the Korean War. It was actually called also the Second Indo-China War, and in Vietnam they called it the American War, and it went to 1975. So for 1 year, President Gerald Ford signed the Indo-Chinese Migration and Refugee Assistance Act of 1975. That act authorized 130,000 refugees in that year with special refugee status and financial assistance from the government. That's the first time we see that. Up till this time, everybody had to be sponsored. It was a family member sending them money for their boat trip or plane trip over eventually, and helping them find jobs and helping them find a place to live. Now the government was involved with financial assistance. In 1975, 3,800 people came to Minnesota from Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam as legal refugees. But the sponsorship was still in place, so many churches sponsored people, many individuals sponsored people, and had people living with them in their homes, helping them get on their feet. It was a large amount of people to come in 1 year's time. And then we see in 1980, the Hmong first appear at the Festival of Nations, showing us all their gorgeous embroidery and work that they do. So resettlement from 76 to 81 in the state of Minnesota was 9,200 Hmong, 7,500 Vietnamese, 2,800 Lao people who were also from Laos, and 2,000 Cambodians. So, time for a new law. In 1980, the United States Refugee Act was passed unanimously by the Senate. I don't know if anything ever passes unanimously these days, but it was time and there was agreement there. President Jimmy Carter is there with our Minnesota Vice President Walter Mondale. This picture has nothing to do with signing this act, but it's just a nice picture I found. It created a new definition of refugee based on the UN Convention and Protocol on the Status of Refugees, and included having a well-founded fear of persecution. So that's something new, that you don't have to have a war going on. It could be political persecution, it could be religious persecution. Just had to have that well-founded fear, and you could claim asylum and have to prove your case, but that was a new way to come. It raised the cap to 50,000 refugees admitted each fiscal year, and established the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that was the first time where there was this government office involved, and that's still the case today. So who came to Minnesota from 79 to 89? Again, we think it's Vietnamese, Hmong, Cambodians, but there was a lot going on in the world. So who came to Minnesota? We had a war in Afghanistan. The Mariel boat left was in 1980. People coming from Cuba. The Soviet Union, there was a lot of stuff going on with perestroika, and the people that came from places like Hungary and Romania and Poland, 80% of those people were Jewish. So there was another pushback against Jewish people in the former Soviet Union. And of course, we know about the uprising that happened in Poland as well. So 31,000 people came as refugees or came asking for asylum in that decade from 79 to 89. So time for a new law. The Immigration Act of 1990 was signed by President George H.W. Bush. It was introduced by Senator Ted Kennedy, a Democratic senator, put forth a bill, signed by a Republican president. And imagine that. It opened up resettlement from more countries and introduced new kinds of immigrant visas. It began the diversity visa lottery. It's literally a lottery. You apply for a visa, and they pull your name out, and you won the golden ticket. There's requirements, of course, to be able to immigrate in that way, but a lot of the Ethiopians who are coming now come on that visa lottery. It expanded the H-1B worker visa program. It allowed 700,000 immigrant visas per year. It created the temporary protected status visas for people from countries with natural disasters or adverse conditions, such as El Salvador and Liberia. From the news, if you've been paying attention, we know that those people are still here with TPS status. This act guides immigration policy today and has brought an increased diversity to the U.S. So who came in that time? Again, conflicts all over the world. The war is still going on in Afghanistan. There was a war in Bosnia in 1993. In Burma, August 8, 1988, there was a student uprising, a student protest in Burma. In Africa, different things going on in Africa. Cubans came again, Iran and Iraq, crisis on both ends there. This picture shows the Kosovar refugees fleeing their country. Somalia had the start of their civil war in 1993. Sudan had a civil war. North and South Sudan were at war. Zaire, the former Zaire, became the Democratic Republic of Congo. Lots of things happening in this decade, and those people were coming. A little bit smaller amount, 26,000 came to Minnesota. And again, we see new cultural groups coming and participating in the festival. The Eritrean group came in 1998, and again, Michael Sylvan's database, just click on it, boom, there it is. Got the picture stand in the 1998 folder. I just can't thank Michael enough for all the work that he did on this. So it was really neat to be able to see the waves of people coming and how they come in to the Institute and participate in the festival. And then the Somali group first appeared in 1999. If you made it to the Minnesota Historical Society to see the Somali exhibit, it just closed, you would have seen similar items there. And again, these are things that people carried with them. When they fled their country, they took these things with them and brought them to Minnesota and can show them at the festival. Okay, in 2001, we had the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. So refugee arrivals just stopped. I was teaching at the Institute that night, and nobody came to class. And it was just a very eerie time. In 2004, the government in Thailand closed a refugee camp at the Wat Tam Kravat camp, and they were going to send them back to Laos. And our city, Mayor Kelly, sent a delegation to find out how we could help. And I think the number was about 1,400 Hmong came to St. Paul in that year. It was the biggest amount that had ever come in 1 year. So that's a picture of the Thai refugee camp. And here's a picture of a refugee camp in Kenya. Quite different. So Somalis were still coming in this time. Again, crises happening all over the world. People coming for different reasons, but mostly political strife. Again, the number goes back up to 33,000 people coming to Minnesota as refugees or asking for asylum. And then we see the new cultures coming to the festival. So this is the Karen people. They are an ethnic minority from Burma, but there's many different cultures. There's a Karen culture, and there's Burmese people here as well. They first came in 2006 to be in the festival, and this picture's from 2010. And then domestically, not a lot was able to change with the policies. People were always trying to change the policies, but we just couldn't get agreement. In 2001, 2006, there was attempts to change the immigration policy. So Obama had an idea to protect people who came as children, as undocumented migrants. And so he issued a memo to the Department of Homeland Security to use its discretion to protect the undocumented immigrants from deportation and allow them to apply for temporary work permits. This was not a new law or an executive order. It was just a memo, just a suggestion. And they took it on. To be eligible, immigrants must be between the ages of 16 and 31 at the time of application and provide proof of residence in the United States before the age of 16. The program also required enrollment in a formal education institution. However, the program only granted a 2-year renewable deferred action plan. So that's why it's DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So immigrants must reapply every other year. Those people were very brave to apply for this program. They gave all of their information to the government. They applied at the Institute. They were very busy. They served 1,200 people in that year applying for DACA. And again, that's being debated now as well. And so we have data from the state through 2017. So again, the number's smaller. It's back down 17,000 people so far. We have a new group from Bhutan. The Bhutanese refugees, they were in Bhutan, but they were ethnically Nepali. And Bhutan kicked them out, sent them back to Nepal, where they did not have homes. So they've been in refugee camps in Nepal. So that's a new community that's coming. People from Iraq, many of the people coming from Iraq are soldiers who were in the coalition forces, who our government promised to bring over here. It's been a delayed process. There are quite a number of people here, but it's a slow process getting people here. Again, all over the world, crises happening. So the new president has been pushing back, closing doors. We see that cycle happening again. Immigration is in the news every day. There's things happening all over, changes happening pretty rapidly. The executive order protecting the nation from foreign terrorists entering the United States went in effect in January. It reduced refugee resettlement to 50,000 people. That's back to 1980 levels. It stopped resettlement for 120 days. Anyone who was in process, it was stopped. It banned refugees from Syria. We had refugees coming from Syria, but it banned them from continuing to come. And the travel ban was people from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, all of which are Muslim-majority countries. It revoked more than 60,000 visas. People who had visas, they were revoked. It was blocked by many state courts. But the Travel Ban 2.0 was reissued with the same title in March of 2017, and then the Travel Ban 3.0 was in September 2017 and added the countries of North Korea and Venezuela. So the Supreme Court heard the case in June of 2018. The Supreme Court endorsed the President's power to exercise broad authority in suspending the entry of foreign national groups. So where are we now? So Charan analyzed the data from the American Communities Survey. It's a 5-year estimate that was done from 2012 to 2016. We now see 7.8% of the population of Minnesota is foreign-born, but more than 90 countries are represented. So not just the Northern Hemisphere anymore. And the population at that time was estimated to be 5.5 million people. And then she went through the data of the Institute's resettlement records. We had good data from 1980. The previous years wasn't good data. So up through 2018, the Institute has resettled nearly 23,000 refugees and asylees from more than 35 countries. They're not the only organization doing this work in Minnesota, but they're the only secular organization. All the other organizations are church or faith-based organizations. And then the graphic, you can see the color scheme shows that the darkest colors is where we've resettled the most, and the red country there is Laos. So that would include the Hmong and Lao people. And then she created this graphic to show all of the countries of people. Again, these are the foreign-born people. So it also would include immigrants who come on spousal visas or travel visas and get married, student visas, so many, many countries of people. We think it's probably about 100 countries of people living in Minnesota. And so we count the data then from the state for from 79 to 2017. The primary arrivals of people coming to Minnesota as refugees or asylees is 108,000 people. Somalia now is the biggest. Hmong from Laos is 22,000. Vietnam, 15,000. Former Soviet Union, many countries represented there, 9,000 people. Burma is 8,000. Again, that's a pretty new group, and that's a pretty fast growth of that number. Ethiopia would include the Oromo people as well. Cambodia, a lot of people from Laos, Liberia, and then Bosnia, 2,380 people from Bosnia. That surprised me. That number was bigger than I thought. In my 20 years of teaching, I've only had one student from Bosnia, but they were probably learning English in their country, so they probably don't need my class. So this is all because I was researching the Institute's 100th anniversary. The Institute has a legacy of making a difference in the community. The mission is to help new Americans achieve self-sufficiency and full membership in American life. The Institute supports this mission by providing linguistically and culturally accessible services that enable every new American to work toward achieving full community participation and self-sufficiency. The cultures are different, the languages, the religion is different, but it's the same mission and the same work for 100 years. As of 2018, the Institute annually serves more than 4,000 clients from nearly 100 countries. More than 50 employees, so up from 4, More than 50 employees and many volunteers and interns work in the departments of refugee resettlement, immigration, employment, job training, English and Spanish language classes, college readiness, and the Festival of Nations. The Institute Resettlement caseworkers currently speak Amharic, Arabic, Burmese, French, Karen, Kiswahili, Oromo, Russian, Somali, Spanish, and Tigrinya. So not Norwegian and Polish anymore. This picture shows the nursing assistant graduation at the Institute. That's the program that I last worked in when I was there. The teachers are in front. One of the teachers is from Liberia. The students are in the back. As of 2018, they had trained 2,000, more than 2,000 now, nursing assistants who work in nursing homes and hospitals in our community. And since that time, one of the students has become a master's certified nurse and is teaching at St. Paul College last time. The Festival of Nations is still going on. It happened the first weekend in May, and you can see it most of the time. I think that will still be the date. First weekend in May, first full weekend in May, I should say. It's the longest running multicultural festival in the Midwest. Since 1932, they started with 15 cultural groups. Now there are 90. There are 1,000 volunteers that help. You could be one of them if you're interested. And 50,000 attendees. It's really important, though, it's a fundraising event. When you go to the state fair, you have to kind of remember that too. When you buy your ticket, you're supporting the state fair. And when you're buying your ticket, you're supporting the Institute. But also the culture groups that participate, they are nonprofit organizations. So when you shop at the marketplace booths or you shop in the food booths, you're supporting an ethnic group that is a nonprofit. So my friends at the Japanese American Citizen League, they run the market booth. And the St. Paul Nagasaki Sister City Committee, they run the food booth. So spend your money freely and feel good about it because you're supporting many, many different organizations. And I wanted to highlight one of the families that is a typical family that you will see within the culture groups. We often now see 3 and 4 generations of family members participating in the Festival of Nations. But this is a special family. This is Michelle, Michael, Micheline, and Mitchell. So Michael Sylvan is there in the center, and his grandma, Micheline Raymond. She was a displaced person to the United States in 1951, and her family was assisted by Dr. Gronowski and the Ukrainian church in Minneapolis. She first participated in the Festival of Nations in 1956 as a young girl. She was an institute caseworker beginning in 1978, and in 1980 she was helping Cubans in St. Paul. She was the Festival of Nations director from 1982 to 1999. She was so organized. Everything was so meticulously kept, and the work that she did, really, it just makes the festival what it is today. Everything rides on her shoulders. Well, they brought her back, 2001 to 2007, and Micheline and Michael are here. And like I said, this is just the heart of the festival, is family members, 3 and 4 generations of family members participating in the festival, celebrating their culture, sharing it with all of us. You can go and become a part of one of the culture groups. Most of us, it's kind of hard to pick which one. Which one would we go in of the 7 or 8 or 10 that we are? But this is this family, so I wanted to highlight them tonight. And the Institute has created an exhibit to tell their story, their 100-year story. It's called Unity Without Uniformity. It's on display right now at the Ramsey County Historical Society in the gallery and Landmark Center. And then it's also going to be at the Elmer Anderson Library. So that's at the West Bank of the U of M. That's where the Immigration History Research Center Archives is. So it was a partnership with the Institute, Ramsey County Historical Society, and the Immigration History Research Center Archives. And then you've got the magazine here. I was going to say, if you're not a member and you don't have the magazine, but you can get it tonight, it's also online. You can read the article. There's much more detail about the Institute itself. And then my grants from the Minnesota Historical Society, I had to write articles for Minipedia. That's an online encyclopedia. It's a really great research resource. I wrote articles on the St. Paul Resettlement Committee, Ruth Tanbara, the Institute, and the Festival of Nations. They're all fact-checked, and all my references are there. So anyone who wants to do further research can just go for it and hit it. And again, the beautiful pictures that Michael scanned that were in the boxes at the Institute are on display there. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Again, 40 people helped me with this project. It was not me alone. McAllister pulled a lot of weight, and foundation money paid for a lot of this work. And thanks again to Chirandolma. The Twin Cities Japanese American Citizen League, I couldn't have done my research without them. Ramsey County Historical Society has been on board with this project from the beginning. Immigration Research Center Archives at the U. I have to thank the Legacy Amendment money, which is all of you taxpayers, so thank you very much. And then the Minnesota Historical Society, which gave me the grants. And of course, I'm here because of the 100th anniversary of the International Institute. If you have any comments or questions, there's my email. And I'll take any questions now if you have anything that you'd like to ask. Anybody have any questions?
I've got a statement.
A statement?
Yeah, I know you can't include everyone, but I was interested in finding out that the largest Tibetan group outside of Asia is in St. Paul, and they have a center that you can visit.
Yeah, the Tibet group, they were in the most recent decade. Yeah, it's amazing. Every slide could have been an hour-long presentation. I did research on the Japanese community, but again, I wanted to highlight the Ukrainian community. I mean, there's just so many great stories, but thanks. Yeah, the Tibetan community is the largest outside of where? Or any? Outside Asia. And I think the Somali diaspora, we have the largest Somali population. And I think we are second in the metro for Hmong. First maybe, or second for Hmong as well. So yeah, we are a very diverse place. Not all Scandinavians. Yeah.
So how do you see the festival here as contributing, or to the extent that it does, to this other history which you kind of touch on, which is this constant reiteration of anti-immigrant politics, anti-immigrant feelings? There's a lot of division in this story as well. Does the festival help with that? I mean, is that
I think it's the best 4 days of the year. I absolutely think it's the best thing the Institute does. I mean, they do service every day for people, but that's for the community. And it's for people who have come from war-torn countries with what they brought, and they can celebrate their cultures, and we can learn from them. And I learn something every time when I go. It's also so interesting to think about, you know, everything is political, but everyone's personal stories, we all have those stories in our family. We may not know them. So they're just new stories and new places. So right, it's a lot of division, and I think that the work that the Institute does with the festival is one of the best things. And that was the reason why they had one during World War II. They had one during World War II because they said, we need to show that America is unified. We are all Americans. So yeah, it was a hard decision, another debate, big debate. The German group and the Italian group, they were gonna quit and not go. But they ended up participating, and they decided not to have flags, because flags are political symbols. So they did something different that year, but the flags are always there, and we are always careful about not having certain countries' flags by other countries' flags. And when you put the exhibits together, certain countries aren't by other countries. I mean, you do have to walk a fine line, yeah. Another question?
Great presentation. It raised dozens of questions for me, but most of them are probably out of scope. But I was wondering if you knew, like, since the 80s, 70s, 80s, is it true, is my perception true that the majority of immigration in this country would be refugees, asylum seekers?
So no, it's not. So the 1990 put forth 700,000 immigrant visas. And so that's, again, a number that's being debated, and the H-1B worker visa program. So a lot of people are coming as a choice, as immigrants. So the refugees, I think I said in the one slide, it's back down to 50,000, but that's actually not how many who came. I think in 2017 it was only 33,000 were allowed in. So that is actually shrinking,
So
but the need is growing nationwide.
So that group would be about 20-25% of the total, is that?
Yeah, I don't even know
like
a percent.
An approximate guess?
Yeah, and I really can't say. I mean, it changes from day to day, right? What is being debated and what's being signed with executive orders and kind of pushed through. But no, it's immigrants are definitely the biggest number. And of course, I should have said, we're not counting undocumented immigrants. Mexicans are actually the biggest foreign-born community in Minnesota, but it's not a number that we really have a good count on. So again, the 2020 census is really important, that we can get a good count, but there's people that might not want to be counted in the census. Yeah. Other questions? Are you all hot? Yeah.
Krista, I just have a question. Your numbers, especially lately, don't count foreign-born babies that are adopted by American citizens?
Right. So those numbers were just the refugees and asylum seekers, and I think I had it on the slide. It doesn't count the secondary migrants. So people can be resettled in Georgia or Texas and not like it and go, oh, I've got a cousin in Minnesota. They're called secondary migrants. So we have a large community of Somalis that come, they don't want to be in Georgia. They come to Minnesota because they have friends and family here. But you don't get a choice when you get resettled. So you're lucky to come, but then you make your way to Minnesota if that's where you want to be. Yeah, so there's so many other numbers that I didn't have access to. And that was what Sharon tried to put a number around that. And that American Community Survey is really important data, but it's just an estimate. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
So, the certain groups get resettlement benefits, right? So like refugees, asylum seekers versus immigration, is that?
Right, immigrants have to
these
have...
are issues that come up for me, and
Yeah.
they're hot issues for people. And
Right,
just
so
trying to- a little more clarity.
That diversity visa, you have to have a high school diploma and a certain amount of money, but that's dependent on the country that you come from. So you have to come with a certain amount of money. You cannot be a public charge when you're an immigrant. And that was a new thing that we started hearing about, looking into people who were here and trying to decide if they were a public charge. That came back again. When you're a refugee, you do get some money from the government, but it's for a limited time, and you have to pay back your airfare. It's a loan from the government, so every person has to pay back their airfare. And so yes, there are benefits, and of course they get signed up for county benefits as well pretty quickly after arrival. But when you come as an immigrant, you have to have a certain amount of money in the bank. And the other thing I was going to mention, what was the other? You said immigrants, refugees,
Well,
and...
I guess, and asylum seekers.
Right,
refugees.
asylum seekers is an interesting process. They are essentially on parole. They come and ask to be able to be here. Their court case is pending. They're essentially put on parole, and they can't work. So it's a really tricky process. I've known many people who are here dependent upon the kindness of strangers to put them up, feed them. Churches are now taking people in. My own church has had a man from Tanzania. They thought for sure it would be someone who spoke Spanish, but it's been someone from Tanzania living in the basement of our church. So it's a really tricky process, but again, it's that whole idea of if they can get here, then they can ask for asylum. And getting here is the challenge on their end. Yeah, so there's so many different situations, and they're all kind of pending right now. It's a really tough time right now. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Does Cuba still have a booth at the festival?
No, the Cuban community is really small, and it's really interesting. There was a student in the McAllister class who was Cuban, Cuban American, and she was like, I want to find out where they are. I want to get them to the festival. And yeah, even the Somali booth isn't always, they're there sometimes, but there's not a community of people there to run it. It takes a lot of people to run these booths, and I've heard, is it the Swiss are done? Like some of these groups are kind of aging out and they're not getting the young people. Is that right, Michael? Is it the Swiss? Danish, okay.
How about
So
the
no
English?
able skippers.
Are the English still there? Because if not, I'll have to come and...
That's right.
They're not?
No, there's no English.
Yeah,
Really? Okay,
yeah.
I'll be there next year, Krista.
Yeah. And I brought students there and they're like, where's my country? I'm going to get my people together. And it's a lot of people power that need to do this. Yeah, Micheline.
Can you tell me the difference between displaced persons and refugees?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So the displaced people means that you had to leave your country and you went to another country. And then you were in camps. You were in displaced people's camps. So we do see that we have this distinction still. So people that are from Somalia are living perhaps in Kenya. They're born in Kenya. When they come, it says they're coming from Kenya, but they are Somali. Some call them Somali Kenyans. They are displaced people. But there's also internally displaced people. So there's people that have left their home, but they're still in their country. They're called internally displaced people. And I was going to write down the number. I think it's like 86 million or 68 million people are displaced worldwide. So it's just a growing crisis. We know about the Syrians, that's in the news, but all the time we are hearing about people leaving their countries, crossing dangerous channels, trying to get to Italy or Greece or England. Yeah, it's just a growing crisis, and so we're just a fraction of who we are resettling. But yes, thank you for asking that.
Can I just mention one thing? That the displaced persons who wanted to come to the United States, they had to have a job and where to live and sponsor. The refugees don't have that.
Right.
So those people that came like I am, I was a displaced person, we could not come here unless somebody paid for us, and then of course we reimbursed. But you just couldn't come. You have to have that, especially sponsorship. You have to have, like Professor Donofsky was our sponsor, and it's really interesting how now it's kind of different.
I do think that change made a difference on how refugees are resettled and how they're portrayed in the community, and that idea that, yeah, they're on the government dole and all these misperceptions. And when you bring someone into your home, you make that personal connection, and then they're not the other. But when they're not someone that you connect with, it's easier to talk about them in these negative terms. But she's absolutely right. We saw the sponsorship of Japanese out of the camps. They had to be sponsored, the displaced people after World War II. And then the Cubans. The Cubans were sponsored by the Episcopal Church when they came in the 60s. And then even that first wave of Hmong and Vietnamese and Cambodians, they had some government assistance, but they were sponsored. People had them in their homes, and churches opened up their basements. So that changed with that 1980 policy. And for better or for worse, but you're absolutely right. You were just so lucky to have a person sponsor you, and your life would be completely different if you had stayed in your country. And that process has changed.
And also displaced persons were during the wartime. They were displaced because of wars.
Yes.
So that's different than the temporary relocation status, right?
Right, the
Which is
TPS was meant to be temporary.
A natural disaster or something.
It's like Haitians had TPS. I forget when that crisis was, but yeah, then maybe you get married, then you have children, you have a house, and now the government's saying, oh, that was supposed to be temporary 20 years later. So yeah, the idea of amnesty, trying to do some work for these people. There was an Augsburg professor who was here that they, I don't know what happened with him, but they were trying to send this Augsburg professor home, back to his country, and yeah, and Liberians, a lot of the Liberians that are here came on TPS. So El Salvadorians and Haitians, and they're still here in our community as of now, but every day it's got to be scary for them. Thanks for asking that. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming, and again, I know half of you, so thank you for coming that don't know me. And again, if you have any other comments or questions, please send me an email. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. Could you please stand if you are a former Institute employee? I've got some former Institute employees that are here. So, fellow English teachers, thank you very much. Okay.
Krista, let me just say, if you don't need to use the bathroom but have a minute, please take a walk down the staircase and see the mural that was painted